we'll close the door.
Oh, sure.
What's going on? Might have her in the bathroom.
Pardon me, what's going on?
Putting a new stool in the bathroom
Oh,
and
there was
tile
a
in
young lady
the
working
office.
in the bathroom and a man working in the former office thing on the floor. I just peeked in and got, no, I didn't. No, I don't want to.
Okay, so let's talk some more about Esther here, and today let's do some structural analysis since we're most of the way through the story, and as another technique, another lens through which to read the story. So many times in the Bible, passages or whole books are built on a particular kind of structure. And there are a variety of structures. For example, Psalm 119 is built on an acrostic. That means that that each verse in a section begins first with the first letter of the Hebrew alphabet. The second section begins with the second letter of the Hebrew alphabet. The third section begins with the third letter. All the verses begin with that letter. That's what an acrostic means. That's how Psalm 119 is built, for example. Now, why would anyone do this? For a couple of reasons. For one thing, this is what artists do. Robert Frost was once asked why he didn't write free verse, why he always wrote in meter and rhyme. And he said writing poetry in free verse is like playing tennis without a net. It's just not any fun.
Oh, which words these are, I think I know.
Yeah.
It just goes on a little rhythmical thing.
Yeah.
Yes, I guess so.
Yeah, and so to just not have any rules or restrictions for most people means it's no longer art. It's just playing around.
Oh.
The challenge of a sonnet, for example, is to write something meaningful within the structure of the sonnet.
Yeah.
To write an acrostic poem, which is what Psalm 119 is, all 176 verses of it, is an artistic accomplishment as well as a theological one. That kind of thing shows up. Acrostics show up several times in the Old Testament in particular, but other structures are also used. And several scholars have suggested, and I think quite rightly, that the book of Esther is made using a particular kind of structure. And that structure is called a chiasm. And that's what that word is here. It's called a chiasm because it is because the word comes from the Greek letter chi, that we would say is an X, and it's a chiasm because the structure is built in the shape of an X. That it starts from the top and the outside and works toward a center point and works back out again from that center point. And in this, and why does this matter? This matters because the center point then is where the author intends the meaning to be, the punchline to be. So determining where that is not just, job security for literary critics, which it's that too, but it also is a way to try to read the author's mind, to understand where the writer or writers think the emphasis should be. And unfortunately for our purposes, it will be different than we thought it was. Which I've been sitting on this for a while, so I'm waiting for this egg to hatch a little bit here.
With that X, do they come into the center and go back on the same, or come in and go out?
Well, we'll try to describe that. So we'll work from the inside out. The actual X, the pivot in this analysis is in chapter 6, verses 1 through 14. That's the center of this structure. And that passage describes how Haman is humiliated and Mordecai is elevated. And if that's the center of the story, then Esther is not about Esther. Esther is about Mordecai, which we here, I think, find some way, if that's true, we find that a bit disappointing, since we've been having great fun with Esther as the character.
Yeah.
So how does this work? In chapter 1, verses 1 through 8, there are 2 feasts. Okay. At the end here, there are 2 feasts. Okay? It's not anything mystical or anything like that. It's just structural analysis. Here, Esther becomes queen.
Oh, yeah?
Okay. Here, Queen Esther acts like the queen. She saves Mordecai, and she and Mordecai save the people. Here, Haman is put in charge. Here, Mordecai is put in charge. Okay? Next, Haman's decree to destroy the Jewish people. Down here, Mordecai's decree to save the Jewish people. Okay? Here, Esther and Mordecai plan to reverse the decree. And here, Esther and Mordecai plan to reverse the decree. Now, first it's Haman's plan, and second it's the king's. Down here, it's the king's order that the Jews should all still be killed. Here is the first banquet, Esther's first banquet. And here, Esther's second banquet. And so, as scholars look at the text and do this kind of analysis,
Yeah.
They find their way toward the center of the chi, toward the center of the X. Okay, so just for a little bit of entertainment and edification, let's go back to Esther 6, 1 through 14. And reread what is at the center of the book according to this analysis. So on that night, the king could not sleep. He gave orders to bring the book of records, the annals, and they were read to the king. It was found written how Mordecai had told about Bigthana and Teresh, 2 of the king's eunuchs who guarded the threshold and who had conspired to assassinate King Ahasuerus. Remember, here's the section where we kind of rehearse the whole history, first part of the book here, and the king has been stupid and didn't know about it. Then the king said, "What honor or distinction has been bestowed on Mordecai for this?" The king's servants who attended him said, "Nothing has been done for him." The king said, are you going to just throw that one away then?
Well, there's a whole set there.
Yeah, I know.
Oh, they're all black?
No, I'm going to put it back.
No, the one I was using you should throw away.
There you go,
Okay.
Dan. All right, there you go.
So, let's see.
Pardon me.
Nothing has been done for him. The king said, "Who is in the court?" Haman had entered. Well, we know the story. So here is the flip. Here's the pivot. Here is where the story turns. Here is where Haman's comeuppance happens and Mordecai's ascendance begins. It's moved toward one point and now it moves away toward another point. As a literary device, this is from a reviewer of this technique. As a literary device, a chiasm shows how the way words and ideas are structured can communicate a message just as powerful as the words themselves. It's a brilliant technique that good authors often use, and the anonymous author of Esther is no exception. And if we see it this way, the pivot in leading to the fall of Haman and the rise of Mordecai, then we can perhaps see a message being communicated, that the shape of the story itself can tell us something about what's being communicated. And so now Michael Fox in an article, this is Michael V. Fox, not Michael J. Fox, so now we've got that straight here. He writes, the center of the story portrays a dramatic parallel between Haman's decree and Mordecai's counter-decree. The author of Esther sees justice unfolding itself in history. This means, first of all, that history is portrayed as a sequence of ordered events rather than a collection of random coincidences. This view of history is in itself reassuring for a people in exile, buffeted by forces which they have little power to influence, which could easily lead to despair. The author of Esther fights it, the despair, in his own way by revealing a meaningful order in human affairs, particularly an order that involves reversal of the expectations of the wicked. So, part of Fox's analysis and conclusion is that in producing a strictly ordered narrative, and that's what a chiasm is. I mean, there is a strict correspondence from the one half to the other, that the structure itself is intended to communicate a sense that history has an order and a purpose to it for the Jews, rather than just this random and seemingly arbitrary exercise of power, especially on the part of Haman, but the king as well, who again doesn't appear to have the king doesn't seem to have any rhyme or reason to why he does much of anything, except that somebody says, maybe you should do this. And the king says, that seems like a good idea. I mean, is there any better sort of portrayal of this sort of randomness of history than the king? You know, things just sort of happen for no good reason. And Fox's analysis says that the author of Esther, by the very structure of the story, seeks to combat that sense that what happens in history is without meaning, purpose, or direction or structure. So let me stop for a minute, and yes, I know this sounds to most people, I think, like a whole lot of baloney that just keeps biblical scholars in business, but I think there's something to it. I don't think that it is the only lens through which to read the story by any means. And I'm as disappointed as anybody that it is this turnaround between Haman and Mordecai that's at the pivot instead of something about Esther, because she's much more fun. But there is something to it. Again, not the only thing, but something. I think it's helpful for you folks who are really good Bible students to have at least an awareness of another tool for analysis. You know, not that you'll ever read something and say, yeah, there's a chiasm. Did you? Well, you may.
You might.
You may. It may jump out at you. Yeah.
Remember, she wrote.
Oh, absolutely. There you go.
And said, aha! At the end of the story, she figures it out. That must be the center.
Wait.
No, that's a little different structure. No, I think that's probably a little. There's a structure.
Right.
to every one of those episodes. I mean, absolutely. But I don't know that.
That's not the center, all right.
Well, I'd be reluctant to draw a firm conclusion because I suspect that sometimes maybe there is a chiastic structure. Now, if you, there are some authors that are more intentional about this. If I'm kind of have been for a long time a G.K. Chesterton fan and Agatha Christie as well. If you read the Father Brown mysteries, sometimes you'll see chiasm in this but only in retrospect can you ever really see the center. It's not completely obvious at the time, but things move toward a particular place and there's this pivot and then things move away from it. And then as a reader, you go back and you think, oh yeah, that's where it happened. See, now I feel so smart because I figured out that's where it happened. I mean, this is, good mystery writers do that to us. They make us feel smarter than we are. So sometimes in Father Brown, you might see some chiasm, or in some of Agatha Christie. And, once you're looking for it, it starts to come out a bit more. But here in Esther, part of the question that we ask is, who is this about? Who is it really about in the story? Well, it seems to really be about Esther. She's the character who grows, who changes, who learns, who takes the initiative. And I don't want to get too far away from that. But does the structure indicate something else or something in addition? Is there a kind of a theology of history that is built into this? Because remember, God's not mentioned. It's not clear that God is working behind all of this. And so perhaps the author really does want to communicate that, in fact, this is all a part of the plan, And the plan has a structure and an order, and we can see it if you know where to look, if you know what the key is. So I think that's probably a legitimate part of understanding Esther. And I wanted to mention it at this point because, our major question today is, as you may recall, those of you who were here, why is it in the book? Why is it there? God's not mentioned. There's the Purim massacre at the end where 75,000 people are killed. There's trafficking apparently at the beginning. There's lots of things about it that aren't all that attractive or perhaps edifying. Why is it in there? And especially for those of us who don't have Judith in our canon, which we'll look at probably next week, Judith seems a lot more edifying. God's mentioned all over the place, and there are long theological speeches, and the good guys win, and it's obvious, and yet Esther's in the book and Judith is not. Was that just a historical accident? Does the Holy Spirit have some intention in this? What are we supposed to get out of it? And if we have some trouble figuring out what it's about, it can be a little harder to figure out what we're supposed to get out of it. So this is another lens for us to use as we look at it, and now biblical scholars can feel smarter than the rest of us because they figured out something that we didn't see. So isn't that lovely? So now the important, I think the interesting question that has no definitive answer: why is it there? What's it supposed to do for us, to us, through us? What does reading and studying the book of Esther, what's it do for you, to you, through you? Now, I think that's a place to start that conversation, rather than let somebody else dictate to us what those answers might be.
I gave this talk at home This might be a simple thing, but it can change.
Fortunes can change. Fortunes, you know,
People.
the structure certainly indicates that, doesn't it?
Yeah, that's what I think.
You know, the book of Esther is this whole series of reversals, and some of them fairly comic, in fact. I mean, there's sort of some connection between Esther and the Three Stooges at some point, as Amy Jill Levine points out. Not it isn't only that they were all Jews, but that's true too.
Yeah.
But Haman being asked, what by the king, what should I do for this wonderful, upstanding person who is, and Haman thinking he's describing his own triumph, and then he ends up, leading Mordecai's horse through the city. I mean, there's a comic reversal to that almost. So there are all these reversals of. But John, reversals of what? Because that word fortune has about it, sort of some of the odor of chance. Doesn't it? I mean,
That is true.
I mean, it's not necessarily, but often that word is used that way. To be fortunate is to have somehow benefited in something in unexpected, perhaps, ways. So there are reversals of what? Of fortune,
Maybe no.
of destiny. What? Yeah, Al.
I like fortune because the Jews did nothing to cause it.
Yeah.
Is it red?
They didn't do anything
Mm-hmm.
to cause their change, except for Esther.
They didn't do anything to get in trouble either, except for Mordecai.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, they also annihilated Haman's family way back when, ancestors.
Well, there's another piece of it, isn't there?
Whether that had any effect or not, I don't know.
There is. It's really emphasized in the text. This sort of what goes around comes around is a little bit in there, without a doubt. There's this centuries-old blood feud between the Israelites and the Amalekites that comes to bear here, and that, at least for the author, certainly is intended to be part of what sort of drives the plot, at least early on. Yeah, Mel.
See, when I first read this book, I never got that, but then, I never connected the dots. I never connected when I read Saul and that's
Yeah.
and connected it with this. It just never entered my mind
Yeah.
until you said something.
This is one of the challenges, I think, of reading anything in the Bible, but this is so culturally embedded in some ways. We have to track down all these things that for, sort of a native reader would just be in the air. I mean, it would just be part of the assumption. So, yeah, that's always part of the challenge of reading a biblical text, is finding our way as best we can into the mindset, into the worldview of the writer, which is why we have to sit and study instead of just reading it, because that's just not going to happen on its own. So there's this centuries-old blood vendetta that drives this. And yet that's not all of it. That provides energy for Haman and Mordecai. It doesn't necessarily account for everything that Esther does. So let's dig away at it some more. What does it do to you, for you, through you? What does it say to you? Yeah.
Well, it shows how God works even when we're not there trying to help it or push it one way or the other. This is going to happen the way God wants it to happen. And we don't know why, but it just happens. And it doesn't have to be mentioned.
Yeah. There's kind of a profound hiddenness of God in Esther. Almost to the point of invisibility. And yet, and that's why this chiastic analysis was worth taking a little time, that some scholars would assert that structure is a way of, how shall we say, embedding God's work and will into the very, the fabric of the story. This is all happening because God wants it to happen. Yeah, Carol.
So, to me, I'm wondering if Esther wasn't God's vessel to make that happen. We've talked about through this whole chapter about God quietly being there.
Mm-hmm.
First we don't know a lot about Esther. Then we find out, that Mordecai adopted her, and then, she becomes queen, and then she fades out. But was she a vessel of God, and her purpose was to bring them to this pivot point and then bow out?
I think this is one of the really interesting challenges of the book of Esther. And especially when we look at this chiastic structure, which seems to put Mordecai and Haman and that conflict into the center of the narrative. And yet it is Esther and her courage that really drives the action in some significant ways. What does, when and I think you're right, Carol, to say so. Esther is portrayed as this vessel to be or instrument of God's plan or action. Some readers, and particularly I think some feminist readers, would look at that and see that as ultimately just another objectification or devaluation of a woman who is subjected to a man's plans yet again, because it's Haman who ends up on top in the story. It's Mordecai. It's Mordecai and Haman who are at the center. So one way that Esther is read is that indeed Esther is used as an instrument, but is no more than an instrument. Now, I think you could say, what's this no more than business? Is
Because we're not talking about an intelligent king, and she knew all the right buttons to push and the right things to say to get what Mordecai knew needed to happen.
But can Esther, in the context of the story, can she be an agent, a person in her own right? Or does, once she's been useful to get Mordecai where Mordecai needs to be, then does she fade off into the sunset?
I don't think so, because we talked about how brave she had to have been to
Mhm.
even have gone to him. Because everything she did when she went to him, I mean, she could have very well been,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
and so, I don't know, I don't see her as the feminist vision. I see her as someone, God's instrument, you know.
And the hero.
To get the right stuff done, yes.
Yeah. Alan, have we run too far beyond where you were going to? Okay.
No, I was just going to say it was Mordecai's idea.
Right.
Mordecai told Esther that
Yeah.
you've got to do this because this is your time in this part of
Phase.
history
Okay.
to save the Jewish people.
So this fits with that chiastic
Oh, yeah.
interpretation that it is at the beginning, it is Mordecai who is the initiator, who drives the action, who puts Esther in place, who does this, who does that. And at the end of it, it is Mordecai who is ascendant. And rightly so, because it's in the script, because that's how the story is built, because that's what's intended by the structure. So that's part of the import of that structural argument, is that when you look at how the story is built, it appears that it ultimately is about Mordecai's triumph.
She had her bright spot, she was a shining star for a while.
Well, absolutely. But, you know, feminist readers would wonder if just because you're a sharp tool, does that make you any more of a tool? I mean, does that, you know, aren't you still just a tool?
Just a tool all the time. Yeah, I guess so, yeah.
I think she.
And I'm not necessarily advocating that, but
Yeah.
I don't want to walk away from it too quickly either, because we like Esther.
Right.
Not just-
And if God hadn't been, I mean, I kind of, at that point, took Mordecai out of the equation, because I think everything she did was more God-led than her uncle's led. I mean, she could have sold him and threw him under the bus too. She didn't, because I think she basically knew that they needed, you know, to reverse the decree and everything, but,
So in a sense, you know, perhaps Mordecai loaded the gun, but only Esther could pull the trigger.
right.
You know, there's something to that. And that had to be, it is true that Mordecai utters, you know, kind of the most memorable line in the book. You know, who knows, perhaps it was for such a time as this that you've been put in this place. And that's a turning point in the narrative, without a doubt. But if Esther had said, well, isn't that lovely, but no, thank you, you know, it would have been a different story, without a doubt. So is she more than this willing instrument? Is one way to ask the question. Is her willingness, is that what really sets her apart? I mean, at that moment, we can think about Esther almost in parallel with Mary at the Annunciation. Guess what, Mary? Do I have news for you? And Mary's response, you know, in the Magnificat, behold, the handmaid of the Lord, let it be to me according to your will. You know, there's some conversation between those experiences. Is being that willing instrument what it means to be faithful? is that willingness to be used regardless of cost, or is that what it means to be a faithful Jew, for example? And, Mordecai is a beneficiary, but not necessarily a model or example. Now, we could probably be very happy with that description if it weren't for the Purim massacre, in which Esther appears to be thoroughly implicated. And the story would have been quite different for Esther if Esther had faded into the background and everything that happens at the end was just up to Mordecai. But that's not what happens. That darn chapter 9 complicates things.
And there should be a page 2. Because we don't
That's
know
what-
what happened when Esther
I-
got all of Haman's.
I wanted the sequel, that she does this again and another one.
Yeah.
What did she do with what she got from Haman,
Well, that's the mark of a good story, isn't it? That, a good story leaves some significant questions unanswered. And so God's work is not done. It's not finished. Now, Al, I'd like to come back to, you were talking about this hiddenness, this almost invisibility of God behind and underneath events. What if anything do you make of that? Does that seem like a description of how God works that speaks to you?
I think it still works in our world today.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah, I think it's still working in our world today. I mean, the Christians aren't changing it that much, and the Muslims aren't changing it that much. But then you look at the whole thing, and the world is slowly changing. I'm not sure if it's good or bad or how it's going to come out, but I trust that it is God's plan to make it come out correctly. And we have to do that.
So what would you, in light of reading Esther, what would you make of the pronouncements of some Christians who are always pretty sure that they know what God's up to?
I think that they must be very smart.
Or
Or
dumb.
dumb.
Because you see, a lot of times I don't see it, and sometimes I don't even see it when I read it.
Yeah, Martin Luther, for example, was always very reluctant to have much certainty about what specifically God was up to at any given time. And even in the great unfolding of history, Luther talked a fair bit about the hiddenness of God. And the greatest hiddenness of God is the presence of God in the crucified. This is the last place where we should expect God to show up.
Mhm.
In the Old Testament it says, "Cursed is everyone who hangs on a tree," which our ears should perk up a little bit after reading Esther too, of course, because there's a lot of hanging on trees that happens in Esther. But that the cross is not the first place that we would look to see God in action. And when Luther talks about the hiddenness of God, Luther talks about how God is often revealed under the form of the opposite. The cross is the last place we would expect to look. The Bethlehem manger is not the first place that you go looking for the Messiah. You know, the tomb is not the first place that you go looking for life. We're so accustomed to all of that. We know it's in the script, right? That's how the story is supposed to be. That the shock and scandal of that's often lost on us. Because we know that's how it's supposed to turn out. But there's no reason in advance to think that's how it would have turned out. That God is revealed under the form of the opposite. And as a matter of fact, Luther referred to those who were really confident about being able to describe exactly what God was up to. Luther referred to such folks as theologians of glory. And theologians of glory are always lying. Because they're always pointing to places and saying that's where God is, and God is very rarely visible in places of glory. It is only with the eyes of faith in the Gospel of John, for example, that we can talk about Jesus' crucifixion as his glorification. And that's what John's Gospel does. But no normal person would think that way. That's not what it looks like. So this hiddenness of God is a theme throughout Scripture and Christian theology as well. It apparently is how God chooses to work. And we're all theologians of glory. We all wish that God would just come out and say, pay attention, here it is, here's how it works. If you don't get it the first time, let me hit you upside the head again. Yeah, nope, not very often. Not very often does it work that way in Scripture or out. So, through our Lutheran lenses, I think we're perhaps more sensitive to that hiddenness of God, and perhaps not as troubled by the fact that God's never mentioned in Esther. One of the great advantages we have, because we have those additions that show up in the Apocrypha, we can have an idea of the discomfort that the book of Esther produced for early readers. Because some of those additions work very hard to make sure that God is no longer hidden. That God is named 15, 20, 25 times in the course of just a few verses, because that was an unfortunate oversight by the original author of Esther, as far as some of those later editors were concerned. That some of those additions, I think, were convinced that people weren't bright enough to figure out that God is there, even though God is not named. And it'd be best to smack people upside the head with it so that we're sure of that. So we can see where some of that discomfort is. Yeah, Al.
Now, I got a question here. If it wasn't for the Feast of Purim, do you think this book would have gotten into the Old Testament?
Well, several dimensions to that. I mean, which came first, the chicken or the egg? I mean, was there some sort of celebration that needed to be underwritten by a story, which is possible? Is Purim as big a deal 2,000 years ago as it is now? We have some sense of that, but not entirely. There's no question that that the celebration of the feast and being part of the sort of liturgical calendar certainly supports hanging on to Esther. Mm-hmm. And it found its way relatively early into these big five scrolls, the Megillot, that get read at festivals. You know, Ruth is another one of those, and Jonah is another. I mean, it's very interesting which of these stories are the ones that get read at some of the festivals. There's a bigger sort of liturgical framework to this as well, because on the Sabbath prior to Purim is always read the story of the conflict between the Amalekites and Saul. And so in synagogue life, the setup to reading Esther is always that blood vendetta story, which then makes the Purim massacre more satisfying. You know, I mean, it gives it more of a narrative framework. It kind of creates a setup. So, at least in some parts of synagogue life, Esther serves some of that function as well. Bringing kind of to a close that whole part of Old Testament history. So it has several functions. It underwrites the Feast of Purim, certainly. It brings to some closure this centuries-old blood vendetta. It perhaps equips Jewish communities to think about whether self-defense under oppression is an appropriate response, because, you know, here in Esther, the answer is yes. You know, if the community is threatened and you can find a military and political way through that, you should. That continues, you know, we talked about this last time, how that continues to have resonance among certain parts of the Israeli political and religious community to this day. To invoke Purim, I mean, that happens, and not only with a murderous radical like Baruch Goldstein, but with sometimes Israeli political leaders as well. So that's a kind of a long answer to a short question. You know, does Esther have traction that makes it attractive to the community that reads it? Yes. Yeah, absolutely. So that's one way to answer why it's in the book. It speaks to the lived experiences of faithful people. Yeah, go ahead.
But if it wasn't for this festival, would it have made it? I know we can't answer that question.
Yeah.
Because I'm assuming they celebrate the festival before they canonized the Old Testament.
Yes, I think that's right. So I think that it's probably beyond dispute that there would have been influence from the festival to keep the book. Yeah, I think that has to be right. On the other hand, it didn't work out quite that way for Maccabees and Hanukkah. Now, you know, Maccabees is read certainly in Jewish communities, but isn't in the Tanakh. It's not in the Old Testament. Now, part of that's just historical because it's set so much later. You know, Esther technically is set in exilic times, 500 BC or so, and Hanukkah in Maccabees is set, in 168. So that's some of it. But yeah, there must be a connection. There must be a somewhat of a historical rationale for this.
What is exilic times?
This is the Babylonian exile that we're talking
Okay.
about.
Okay.
But Esther really is set then after that,
Okay,
after
okay.
the Persians have defeated the Babylonians. That's the setting of it. So the Babylonian exile comes to an end in about the 530s.
Oh.
Cyrus the Persian defeats the Babylonians. A number of the exiled Jews return to Judah, but clearly not all. There continue to be Jewish communities throughout the ancient Near East who didn't return.
Oh.
That's when you hear the term diaspora. That's really what we're talking about, is Jews who were dispersed. The English term would be the dispersion. Jews who are dispersed across the Middle East as a result of the exile and other things and remain in those places. So Mordecai and Esther and community had not returned to Judah at the end of the exile, but remained in the dispersion and in what turned out to be the capital of the Persian Empire, Susa. So that's kind of the historical setting. So we're looking, somewhere in the, this is why it's hard to kind of figure out how the king fits historically, because the Persian king who would most resemble Ahasuerus, Xerxes, doesn't quite fit with the timeline entirely. There's some discrepancy there, and if it is a theological short story, then that's not very troubling. That's just how it worked out. But probably in the mid to late 400s is where it's set in Persia. Yeah, Al.
See, I thought it was a Persian emperor that sent the Jews back.
It is Cyrus.
Okay.
Cyrus the Persian, but not everybody went.
Yeah, okay. It was after they destroyed the Babylonians.
Right.
So they conquered Babylonians, then they sent the Jews back.
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah, which is why Cyrus the Persian in Isaiah 45 is called a Messiah. I mean, it's an interesting use of the Hebrew term. And that simply means anointed for a purpose. That's what Messiah means. And so Cyrus, Isaiah 45 sees Cyrus, the Persian emperor, as God's anointed representative to return the Jews from exile. I mean, that's an amazing theology of history. Remember, for most ancient people, all gods are local. The God of Israel should just be powerful in Israel, and the gods of the Babylonians, Marduk and Ishtar, should be powerful in Babylon, and they shouldn't be messing around in each other's territory. But this God of the Jews seems to go everywhere and mess around in everything and tell everybody what to do, including Cyrus the Persian. It's quite remarkable, that this God of the Jews is calling the shots for all of history, not just a piece of it. Well, so this underlies Esther as well. This is another reason to think that Esther is not this sort of agnostic folktale that snuck in through the back door. Apparently, the God of the Jews is at work here in Persian history, even with the stupidest king on record. And it's a good thing God's in charge, because the king, he couldn't find his nose with both hands, right?
Needs a little help. A lot of help.
So again, back to the sort of the structuralist chiastic interpretation, there is an understanding of God's working in and through history to accomplish what needs doing, including working in and through the administration of the Persian Empire. And so there's a theological kind of kinship, for example, with Isaiah 45 and with Cyrus, who is kind of one of the forebears of the king in Esther. Again, the timeline doesn't entirely work out, but it's not that important. The theological point is more to the point. Let's see, what else do we need to? Other thoughts here? Again, what do you get out of Esther? For you. So all the theologians, they've all gotten paid. That's okay. They're good. It's all right. What's it do for you?
She still is a main character.
Absolutely.
Oh.
Mm-hmm. And what does it mean, and what does it look like to be an instrument of, an agent of God's activity? The combination of humility and courage and decisiveness. I mean, there's something to be said for the Esther character as well. When it comes to it, all of a sudden, she's giving orders. That's in there for a while. Okay, so yeah, thanks, Carol. Al, you were shaking your head,
Well,
which is that's good. I like it.
well, I'm getting, I think we're all agents of God, and we don't have to be an Esther. We can just be ourselves in everyday life and let God work however He works. Like yesterday, this guy got his car stuck in his driveway, and I stopped my car and I got behind him, gave him a push, and got him up in his driveway and got my car and drove away. Probably nothing. I don't know if that means anything in the scope of the world or not. I'm not going to save us from North Korea, but I gave the guy a hand when he was in trouble, and I just walked away. I didn't even tell him my name. I just drove off, and maybe it'll have a consequence someplace else. I do
Pass
not
it
know.
on to someone
But
else.
maybe he
forward.
will pay it forward.
Yeah, but
they
who
should call
knows?
it. Yeah, something. I think
But we all are, and if
Yeah,
we
yeah,
all do
yeah.
little things, it might make a change. Yeah, it might not. We might all get hung for mistake. I don't know.
sometimes we're the recipients of this good behavior.
Yeah.
Selfless behavior, and we have been, and that's just a blessing. Not just a blessing, but I mean,
But
that's,
getting back to what you said about Mary and Esther being kind of parallel and what
Oh.
Al just said,
oh, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I think we're supposed to quietly be those agents. Doesn't matter whether we're female or male. Because if you think about Mary,
Uh-huh.
I mean, we hear a lot about her when she gets impregnated by God and the birth, and then we don't hear a lot about her until she goes to the temple to look for Jesus as well, and then we don't hear a lot about her until he starts teaching. So, I mean, she was still working, she still, I'm sure, was an important agent in Christ's life, but we don't hear a lot about that, and I don't think we're supposed to. I don't want praise if I do something.
That, the verse 14 of chapter 4, I mean, the whole "for such a time as this"
Yeah, that's different.
piece of it, Al, were you brought to that moment in your life for just such a time as?
It could have been.
Yeah, I mean,
You never know. You never know.
Precisely.
Well, first off, I drove right past him because I didn't realize he was stuck.
Yeah.
So then I drove around the block so I could get back and give him a hand. But
You didn't more than just wave. Yeah.
In
Yeah.
in Greek, in particular, there are two different words for time. The one word is chronos, and we know chronology, or a watch really is a chronometer. It's a measure of the passage of clock time, and really what it is because the hand moves, we know that time is happening.
Oh,
I mean, that's what it really is. But then there is another word for time, which is kairos, and that's different than chronos. And kairos means appointed time, or special time, or time of opportunity, time of significance. And that's the kind of time that Mordecai is describing. For such a time, such an opportunity, such a moment, that's probably, for such a moment as this. Sometimes moment we mean just a little piece of clock time. But it also has that sense of a point of significance, of impact. Many times, of course, we don't know that it was kairos, that it was this moment of impact until afterwards. Many times it's only in looking back that we see that. I mean, really, in looking back now, Al, as you tell that little story, you can see more, perhaps, was there some significance to it? Was there some, I don't know, there'll be a time when you'll get to find out whether it was, world-changing significance or not. I mean, and Mordecai's question is, who knows?
Yeah.
Sure.
I love that question. You don't know that this moment is merely chronos rather than kairos.
Mm-hmm.
Who knows if this moment is just another tick on the clock or something of significance? And so there's an invitation that every one of those ticks on the clock can be seen, can be experienced as a moment of significance. Because who knows what it might be? I love that part of Esther. I mean, it's so easy to live life as just this succession of ticks on the clock. And that's sort of the default, but who knows? Who knows what this moment will bring? Søren Kierkegaard, a Danish Lutheran theologian, philosopher, said that part of the mystery is that we live life forward, but we understand it backward.
Yeah.
Who knows what these moments will have meant? And, I certainly have the experience in my life of being able to look back and say, oh,
Yeah.
that's what it meant. Isn't that a surprise? Yeah.
I look back and say, oh, there's where I screwed up again.
Get another set of glasses.
Another stupid thing I
Yeah.
did.
Take them off.
No,
Yeah.
you probably
You-
need somebody feel good to help you out.
Well, but even that's a matter of perspective that can change over time, too. I think of those things where moments of profound regret or embarrassment or, lots of them. And from another perspective, thinking, now if that hadn't happened, this wouldn't have happened, and I wouldn't have learned that. And so even And maybe particularly for most of us, those moments of humility might be the most significant. So that's one of the things that Esther has often